of the last 2 decades, really since Tiananmen Square. It's been a massive increase in what's known as the Great Firewall of China, even to the extent that when the initial revolution was occurring in Tunisia, the Chinese went out of their way to ban all use of the word jasmine because it was being called the Jasmine Revolution. And if you ever go to China, you see the women on the streets selling the jasmine blossoms. They were told, no, you can't do that anymore, even on the streets. And there was this incredible Wall Street Journal story that went and talked to these little ladies who were the street vendors. And they said, do you know why you can't sell that? And they said, no, we're not sure. We heard it's a bad harvest this year. That's the length to which a government that is not like ours will go to suppress speech.
I would just say, Gwen, this takes us back to your initial question about Westboro Baptist Church. What Peter was saying is you've got to decide, do you trust the government to make these decisions as to who's a valid protester and who's not? I mean, the Westboro Baptist Church can be viewed as offensive speech toward the victims' families or toward the deceased families, but it can also be viewed as anti-government speech, and that's exactly what we want to prevent.
Well, let me ask you to follow, because another one of the definitions of speech is political speech. And we, in Washington, we've been suffering through a lot of toxic-seeming political speech. People yelling at people from the floor of the House, you name it. There are a couple questions which we'll get to in a moment about whether this is anything brand new. But let's talk about political speech as speech. For instance, I think about Citizens United. You're former chairman of the FEC, Brad. You know that for a long time there's been this ongoing discussion through many Supreme Court cases about what constitutes speech, whether money constitutes speech, whether you name it. And Citizens United was a perfect case, and you had a hand in that. So make the connection for us between political speech, money, and what freedom really means in this case.
Well, sure. I mean, the first point is that money is necessary to facilitate political speech. That is to say, some people say, well, it's not speech at all, it's giving money, but imagine if we said, well, the New York Times can't spend more than $1,000 a year to publish. I mean, it's gone.
Imagine close.
That's right. Imagine if the City Club couldn't pay to bring, us, this panel here. I mean, we wouldn't be speaking. If we couldn't rent this hall, you wouldn't be listening, you wouldn't get a chance to ask questions. So if you limit speech for the purpose of limiting politics, you have a First Amendment problem there. Then the question is whether there are other reasons why the government ought to be able to put limitations on people's speech. The Supreme Court has rejected the idea that the government can try to limit the speech of some in order to make sure that others are heard. It says, look, that's exactly what the First Amendment's intended to prevent, is the government deciding you've spoken too much, you've got to be quiet. So the egalitarian reason is sort of out the window. But the court has recognized in an effort to prevent corruption of government, you can limit some speech. And that is the reason why we allow limits on campaign contributions, for example. So now the question becomes, how broad can you make those limits go before you're getting into core political speech? In Citizens United, if I can take just another moment here, the decision has been much panned, and of course it allows corporations not to contribute to campaigns, but to make expenditures on their own independently. What should be recognized is that it was the position of the United States government in that case before the Supreme Court was that the government had the power, although they said they wouldn't do it, to limit books and movies and DVDs and transmittal of books by Kindle and so on, if they were political. The government said to a question from Justice Souter that if you had a labor union that wanted to pay somebody to write a pamphlet about labor union rights and how they were important to politics, the government could ban that. They told Justice Roberts that if you had a 500-page book with one sentence advocating the election of a candidate, the government had the authority to ban that. And of course, the case itself was about a movie, a documentary movie. It was kind of a hackneyed documentary hit job against Hillary Clinton, but, it was a documentary movie, that they could ban that. And I think when people realize that radicalism of the government's approach, they understand why the Supreme Court at least felt, boy, we really need to look at this. It may be that folks would still think the Supreme Court got it wrong, but it sheds a little new light on it when we realize the sweeping power government was claiming.
Bruce, did the Supreme Court get it wrong?
No, I think what surprised people about Citizens United was the answering to the question, do corporations have free speech rights? And they said, yes, they do, basically. And I think that was a question that needed to be answered in the political speech context. And do corporations, can they give money to support a particular point of view? And I think a lot of people, reasonable people, could have answered that question differently. But the court said, no, we think corporations do. And it shows the continuation of this broad consensus, as Susan says, this broad, strong reinvigoration of First Amendment protections. There's another case last term, the violent video games case, which you watch some of this stuff and it makes you throw up, except for my children, I don't think.
Who thought it was fine.
Who liked
right.
it, yeah, exactly. Again, the court strikes down a California law trying to prohibit the sale or rental of violent video games to minors, and the court strikes it down. Again, with Scalia dismissing any what so-called scientific evidence that watching a lot of violent video games may have a bad effect and injurious effect on children. And he says, this scientific evidence is completely unreliable and unconvincing. Now, that isn't agreed to by his friend Justice Alito, who says, I'm not so sure. And he does his own, Scalia makes fun of Alito doing his own independent research on violent video games. But Alito, to his credit, goes and watches a lot of these things and then gets a lot of information about where that industry is taking violent video games and says, boy, it's going to be very easy to simulate the real emotional feel of killing people and children. And you're telling me, Justice Scalia, that this isn't going to somehow have an effect on a minor? But the court doesn't buy Alito's point of view.
Okay, so here's the popular distinction, or the distinction in the popular mind, which is it may not be unconstitutional,
right?
But is it helping? Is all of this yelling, this screaming, this incivility, this picketing of funerals, this kids killing each other on video screens, is this healthy? And is that, not even whether government should have a role in it, but just we as people, what are the limits we are willing to put on our expression? Start with you, Susan.
Well, I think it is a really important distinction that you're making in a way, right? We've been overwhelmed and deluged in this technology-enabled information revolution, right? And so now, in a way, it does seem to me that this is probably in some way formed the cultural context for these court decisions, right? That it's almost like, well, what can we do, right? We're overwhelmed. I mean, Facebook has 1 billion users. At the rate at which they're producing content, it's almost like we've given up. We're saying, we can't do anything about this flood of speech, this flood of information. It's all out there, so now we have to come up with new ways of navigating it. That being said, turning back to Washington, where we began, where this panel really often has its focus, these are uncivil times. They're very partisan times. You can argue that this sort of political disputes as entertainment has become, sort of an explosive force in American political life over the last decade. If that's the sport you're interested in, we have more ways of, giving you the sports coverage, right? 24 hours a day. Politics is sport. And, there's no question these are uncivil times. There's a sense here and in many places in the world, right, that Washington is overwhelmed by dysfunction. It's hard not to disagree with that, although, as my husband will say, and I agree with him too, there's a long history, right, and a long context to partisan fights in Washington. I don't think it's purely a product of Twitter or Facebook or even of the Supreme Court that